Today, we're going to be chatting with Florian Herrengt about decision making and picking the right tools.
Hello.
In tech, you very rarely face the same kind of problems in the same context. And you always have to maybe build more performant features. Maybe you have to build it faster. Maybe you have to build it with less budget, less people. And so you end up always having different constraints. And it's about deciding how to tackle and how to solve the problem with those new constraints.
Yeah, that's correct. You always have different constraints based on the project. Sometimes the constraints are changing while you are working on the project. I think the important bit here is that you're capable of adapting to these new constraints. You don't lock yourself into one set of rules or a way of doing something. You have this framework which allows you to be flexible and adapt to those new constraints that are pushed onto you.
An example, I've been building web application for over 15 years. And actually, if you think about it, the applications that I'm building now sometimes are pretty similar to what I was building 15 years ago. A lot of the time, it's about a company needing a website, being able to access some data and then displaying it on the user interface. But still, I always have to relearn and readapt and make new decisions. How am I going to build this utilizing the new technologies? So that's kind of the complexity behind it. And in tech, you constantly have to redefine and redecide how to optimize this. Another interesting thing to see when we make decisions is that there's different levels of decision making. And you could think, how am I going to write this feature at the function level, for instance? Are you going to write a bunch of functions? Are you going to write an object? How are you going to call this? So this is very much at the code level. But at the same time, you also have the feature development, and you could even look higher up at the organizational level. So how is the company going to be built? What kind of skills are we going to look for in people? And how are we going to organize it? So you have a lot of different levels of decision making, and some of them are more or less critical to the future of the company.
Yeah. So I think usually when we talk about choosing technology, engineers tend to focus on the lowest level. What are we going to use? Are we using microservices? Are we using Python or Node.js? Are we writing functional components? All these little things, which very, very low level when you think about it. Then there's a second layer, which is the whole architecture of your tech stack, right? What database you're using, what cloud provider you're going to host your app on. Are you going to use Amazon, Microsoft Azure, GCP? Just like really high level decisions. And then on the top of that, you basically got the business, which, to be fair, doesn't really care about any of that. The only thing they care about is they have an app and they click a button and something happens, and it happens reliably, and they don't have to worry about it, and they can go and start doing some sales. So at a higher level, when you're choosing all these things, you can, as you said earlier, nothing has changed really since 2000 something, or it's just it's always the same thing. You're just like, you go an app and you're going to interact with the database, and then it's going to return something in front of the user. And yet, for some reason, we just keep reinventing the wheel, as it seems, right? Or is it? Because maybe that means that the technology that we're choosing is not actually the main point. Maybe the main point is talent pool. Maybe the main point is how you communicate between each other. So one of the things I like to say is that when you're building an app, there is complexity in this app. Whatever you do, that complexity is going to be somewhere. And when you're making all those little decisions, you basically decide where is this complexity going to live? Where what do I want to deal with? And that decision should be based on your strong points. What are you good at? Are you very good at DevOps? You have really strong DevOps skills in your team, and everyone knows JavaScript very well. Well, then maybe you can go with Kubernetes and build a Node app, right? Or is your app very good with Python? Well, then build it with Python, and they don't have very strong DevOps skills. Well, you can just host it on Heroku and pay more money for your hosting. But what's important here is that you look at what skills do I have in my team, or what kind of skills do I want to access? What kind of people do I want to attract in my company? And then that will drive your decisions more than what is the cool thing to do at the moment. Maybe one of the interesting point that a lot of people are not talking about often is access to talents, but more importantly, what kind of talents do you access? So if you pick like a niche language, I don't know, I'm just gonna pick one like Rust, or Golang's not really niche anymore. It's pretty popular. I think Rust is less used. You definitely see less you definitely see less position in Rust than Node or Python, for instance. So the pool of talents is smaller, but you got to keep in mind that the people that you hire with, for instance, Rust, are going to be technologists. They're going to be people who actually sat at home and decided to learn a new language. So you're attracting like this kind of like very specific people. Yes, the pool is smaller, but you are attracting some kind of like profile, and that depends on what you want, right? If you want to, if you decide to write something in Rust and then you're building a CRM and it's actually not very innovative, then these people are not going to want to work for you, right? They'd be more attracted to working for someone who's doing something a little bit more challenging. And at the same time, if you're building something very specific and you say, oh, I'm struggling to hire, and you pick something like Rust or Go or something like that, and you need to attract highly talented people, well, these people are struggling to find jobs with their favorite languages or their favorite technologies, and you'll be able to attract these people just by using this technology. You'll just be like, hey, look, I got this thing, it's interesting, and it's using the stack that you like.
I completely agree. I also think that companies should think about not just what they are building right now, but also how do they want to grow their company and what it is that they want as a future for their own company.
Yeah.
If you go back to the question of using Rust versus PHP, for instance, or let's say even if you decide to keep in-house developers or outsource your work, again, it's going to have a tremendous impact on your company. Maybe not immediately, but in the next 5 years, the company will look tremendously different if you decide to go one way or another. And it will definitely seem like a decision you can make with a bat of an eye. You can make this decision very easily, and it seems like it doesn't impact that much, but actually it will have a huge repercussions down the line.
Yeah, it is. And the interesting thing is that usually the people who are making these decisions are not the business people, because the business, if you're a non-tech founder, then you're just gonna trust you have to trust whatever the person you hired is actually going to make these decisions. I don't even know they're aware about the possibilities. They're just like, okay, well, everyone's talking about X, so it must be right. I would like to discuss, did you mention something about outsourcing or not outsourcing? When you outsource something to someone, then your company is not doing this anymore. So I'm saying, if you are a logistic company and you outsource your logistic, then you're not a logistic company anymore. You're a marketing company. Like, the only thing you're doing is marketing. So you should see yourself as a marketing company. If you're doing deliveries everywhere and you're hiring someone else to do the deliveries for you, then you're not a delivery company, your marketing company. And more importantly, your competitor can just jump in and hire the same person and provide the same service, exactly the same service as you are providing, just in the snap of a finger by paying these people. Even more importantly, they might be paying them more money, and then they'll just decide that they just go with them and have exclusivity. And then all of a sudden, you lost your whole delivery aspect of your company. And because you're a marketing company, you're a delivery company, then you need to find another provider. And that's kind of what's happening with people who completely outsource their development. So there's different kind of outsourcing. You can have someone inside the company who's technical and understands things and is going to outsource the app to someone. But there's also people who just don't understand anything. They fully outsource to companies overseas. Or the problem is that all of a sudden you're losing all this control around your app, and you have to trust those people for the future of your company, or at least for the future of this product that you're building. This could be a good decision, could be a bad decision. There's no right answer. It just depends on what you are trying to do with your business and where you want to go. And that's why non-technical founders have to understand tech. They have to understand all of these little things that we always talked about, and they sound boring and complicated, but they're so important. And it's really hard to stress the importance of those little details that seem just so trivial, but they compound over the years. And as you said, if you pick PHP or if you pick Rust, you're just going to end up with a very different company 5 years down the line.
And another thing that we can consider also as a constraint when making decisions for technology is around the stage of development of a product. And I think it's really important to consider the fact that building an MVP, your product is under a completely different set of constraints from iterating and from trying to scale a product.
Yes, I have something. So for a lot of time, I tried to get as much as I could into the startup world. I worked in startups, with startups, had my startup, spent a lot of time doing all this MVP, so-called MVP, right? And I think what I noticed is that a lot of the time people tend to focus a lot on the minimal aspect of the MVP. They forget about the viable aspect of it. And you just end up with like these products who are literally not working. They're just terrible, or they don't have any value. And I think the problem with that is there's many problems: lack of vision, lack of leadership, lack of technical skills, bad execution, etc. But one way of kind of mitigating these problems that you always face with building a product from scratch is that you should not build a product you have in mind. I'll give you an example. If you want to build a resort, like a holiday, and you have this grand plan, like all these ideas about how being these luxurious rooms that you have in mind, etc., and you start building this, but you have 20K budget. So you hire people who are really cheap. They probably don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to do these things, etc. And you end up, you find the land, and you're just like, this land is perfect. This is exactly where I need to build my resort. And you start building like this massive thing, but you don't have budget. So two things happen. When you're trying to build something with not enough time or not enough money, you can either not deliver or sacrifice on quality. And most of the time when you hire someone, if you don't deliver, you admit failure. So people will always go with sacrificing quality as much as they can to deliver something. So you just start to get your first customers in, and they pay for this wonderful hotel of you, and they just start to put their luggage in, and someone wants to take a shower, and they open the tap, and there's no water. or the water is like brown or something like that, just like horrible. And then they just start to open the bedroom and there's no bed, or you're just like, obviously they're not going to be happy, right? And it's not about how much they pay. It's not about it's all about the fact that this is not fit. It's not useful. You can't do anything with it, right? So instead of that, if you got like a limited amount of budget, maybe you could buy some tents and provide the tents, and then maybe have like a little communal bathroom and provide some tents, and you start selling that, and then you start getting growth, and then you start having these people using, it's basically a camping, right? And then you start accumulating these people, these users, and you're going to get some money. You can go to an investors and say, look, we have this spot. It's amazing. Like, we got many people coming in. We need more money to build some cabins, and then you start building some cabins. So you just get rid of the tents, start building some wood cabins, and start selling more, increase your prices because now you have cabins instead of like tents, and so on. So it's a very iterative process. If you try to build what you have in mind from the beginning, it's just, unless you go like £1 million in your bank account and you already have a working team and all this kind of stuff, it's very hard. It's just very, very hard to do that. So most of the project I jump on, it's basically the problem. It's just like you start, and week 1 you go through the backlog, and there's 3 years of work, and they want to deliver in 2 months. And the reason for that is not because this project is badly scoped or anything like that. It's just that what they're trying to build is just too big. It's just too hard. So if you just reduce, it's not even reducing your expectation, it's just completely changing what you're trying to do to prove that it works and people are willing to pay for this thing. And then you can start improving it, iterating it, and so on, etc.
A lot of it is also around understanding what are you trying to prove. Because obviously, if what you're trying to prove is that people will want to go and to take the holidays in this area, then you don't need to build a hotel for this. You can, as you say, do it with tents. But if what you're trying to prove is that people will enjoy spending time in those magnificent rooms with a nice Italian showers and massive beds, then this is where the constraint comes in, and you have to use a hotel.
Yeah, but you don't have to use a hotel. Maybe you can build one room somewhere.
Yeah.
Instead of building the whole hotel, you can just like build one room, or maybe you can buy a room in a hotel and then do it up temporarily to see if it actually works. So my point is that you need to be creative with the way you approach the problems, rather than just pushing it down on people and just make it their problem. And I'll just give you some money, just go and do it now, and you're actually not solving the problem.
So another thing that a lot of companies have to consider as well is the strategic advantage they want to develop from making this decision. And so I'm actually going to talk about data architects here, because it's quite a thing that you see a lot in the corporate world. You don't see it at all in the startup world, and when your team are quite small, it's not really a big. It's maybe something that a member of your team will do, but in larger companies, data will be a strategic advantage. It will actually become something that is essential for the future of the company. And that's because data enables everything. Nowadays, if you want to even understand, know, and figure out what is your customer doing, then you need data. If you even want to build new products, you need data. So ultimately, having data, keeping data will help you create a strategic advantage. Now, is it a strategic advantage which makes sense for you? Yes or no? Again, not every data might be important for a company. Some of it is something that they might be comfortable giving away to other companies. Some of it they might also not need to manage it. And every time also you want to keep access and control of this data, is something that you have to actively spend effort, and you have to actively work on it. So it costs resources, it costs effort, money, and time to manage data. But ultimately, being in control and being in charge of their own data enables company to be more efficient. And it is a strategic advantage.
Yeah, I very much agree. I'm also I'm strongly opinionated on privacy and how I think as a field in engineering, we're very loose on how we're dealing with data and how we're protecting this data. But as a company, everything that can be captured or collected is not necessarily worth collecting or keeping. Also, everything that is collected and gathered, so etc., is not necessarily worth keeping as well. So you need to identify that, and usually it's not that difficult, because you can always say keep everything, and the price of data the price of data storage nowadays is very low, so you can keep everything. The problem now is when you start using third parties, or it's the same problem as we discussed before. When you outsource something, then you're losing control on this thing, right? And anyone can use that. So a good example is on a certain cloud provider, you can have an API that will do data extraction from you from documents. So if you upload a PDF, it will tell you like what kind of document it is, etc. And when you start reading the terms and conditions, it basically says that all the documents you uploaded are there to keep forever. Is it worth using this API? Do you want to give away your data to be able to use this API or not? The other thing that is important is to understand what kind of skills you have in-house to start using this data. Do you plan on hiring people to be able to use this data? As I said, storage is so cheap nowadays. Just if you can keep everything, just keep everything, really. Unless it's unlawful, GDPR, etc. There's no reason not to keep everything.
So we talked about the different constraints that come into play when trying to make decisions in tech. So again, some of them are around people, around the stage also of your product development, around the customer and how they're going to use your product, performance, but also data and the strategic advantage that you're trying to create from the product that you're building. So looking very much in the future for the company. And it's important when you consider all of this to try to evaluate and to understand what really makes sense for your company, for your team at this point in time. And it's something which constantly change. And what we call this ultimately is really around value. I mean, it's no wonder that when we try to evaluate the priorities of the tickets, when we're trying to use Scrum and we're trying to kind of estimate how long something should be done, we consider the amount of value that it's generating for the business. Ultimately, when we say value, it's just an arbitrary number which encompasses all those different properties into a unique number so that we can sort things from most valuable to least valuable. And into value, you can consider the time that it takes for your team to build it. You can consider the cost. You can consider the alignment with your current setup. And you can also consider the amount of future assets that it's going to create for you. Another thing is also around dependencies. And is it creating dependencies between you and third parties?
Yeah. So there are three things I want to talk about here. The first thing is vendors are usually driving the technical decisions, or at least they should be. So if you're starting to evaluate, do I go with Amazon? Do I go with AWS, GCP, Azure, etc.? Like theoretically, it doesn't really matter for the technology, right? If you're proficient with AWS, you should be able to switch to Azure fairly quickly. I mean, I play with like the three of them, and there's no major difference that just prevents you from using one from another. So unless there's no difference between the three, fine. But if you got a deal, let's say you got, like in one of my startups, we had an agreement with Amazon, and we had like a large amount of money as voucher, like free credits on AWS. Well, then I'll be foolish to not use AWS, even though if I prefer using GCP or Azure. Because for the money I'm getting on Amazon, I can basically hire 2 more engineers. Like they just give me like the free credits. So really, those decisions should be driven by the business and the kind of agreements that you have between the different people. If you don't, then I think the second should be driven by the skills you have in-house within your team already, and if they're happy to work with it, essentially, because you don't want to force people to work with something if the other option is equally good. The second thing I want to talk about is communication. Communication at 2 levels: communication between developers and the business, and communication between developers. To me, one of the most important thing within the project. Estimation, I am yet to see a good kind of like way of estimating tasks. And more than often, what happens is like you give it like a 2 days estimate, and the task is, if it could have been done in 1 day, it's basically going to be 2 days. And if the task was actually 4 days, then it's just end up being 4 days, right? And it's just very, very, very hard to estimate things. You can estimate based on your previous experience. Last time I had to do that, it took me this amount of time. But it's very, very hard because, as you said, context is changing all the time. You're dealing with different people, different constraints. I think I understand why, from a business perspective, it makes sense to give estimates to tickets. But from a development perspective, it's just what ends up doing is just people just finger in the air. They just like give it like a rough idea. But if you add up all of those things, you'll just end up with, you take all your tickets and you say, well, it's going to take between 2 weeks and 3 months. Because it's very hard to just give these estimates. So I think one way that works much better is to estimate complexity rather than time. So you just look at something and you say, ooh, I think this is hard. And the complexity is evaluated. It's relative to all the things that you have to do. So do you think this is harder than this? Do you think this is harder than this? How much harder, right? So rather than having a set reference, you have like something you want to achieve for the next 2 weeks. How do they compare to each other? How complex they are to each other, right? And how complex is it compared to what you've done last week? And then you can time box this. You can say, we're not going to spend more than 2 days on this task. I think that works much better, because now all of a sudden what you're able to do is you can draw a graph with complexity value, and then you take everything that is the top right corner, what is providing the most value, and the top left corner, lowest complexity, highest value is what you should be focusing on. This is just like the obvious choice. Focus on this thing, low complexity, high value, and then you start talking. Do we want to do something that is like high complexity, high value, or do we want to start tackling these little things there? Anything that is high complexity, low value, you're just delete it from the backlog. You'll never get to it. Just remove it. The second point in communication, so 2 communication points. First one between developers and business. Second communication point between developers. And quite often we're talking about scaling. Oh, we're scaling, we're scalable. We need to build scalable application. What does that mean? What does it mean to scale? So maybe we can have this as a completely separated point. But just to talk briefly about it, when you're scaling, what are you scaling? Are you scaling the number of requests your servers are going to receive? Are you scaling your team? Are you scaling your code base? And all of that is going to be very important as you scale. Like, what do you scale? And a very few engineers in this world have to deal with scaling the number of requests they're receiving. It's a very good problem to have, but it's also a problem that happens very rarely, because most of the time you can just increase the amount of instances, increase the bigger databases, etc., and they're more cost effective. Because if you're going to spend like an extra $100, $200 a month on your cloud bills, it's nothing compared to spending a month, 2 months of engineering, paying these people to actually improve things, right? So I think when we're talking about scaling, most of the time, what we should scale is communication. How do you communicate between people? One of the things that I really like is things that self-document themselves. So GraphQL, I love it because I can write stuff, define what my API is going to return, what it is expecting, and what types, what format. I don't need to talk to anyone. I don't need to write a Swagger file. I don't need to write a message to say things are changed or whatever. Like literally, I just push it, it gets deployed, and I tell you, hey, there's a new version. I changed this. And then they can just go and look at the new structure, what they're supposed to change, and the types that are expecting. Documentation, written documentation, is a depreciating asset. It's something that you're losing. So I think when we're saying we're scaling, we should think about how we're scaling, how we're using technology to improve our communication between developers and the business. Last point is in terms of strategic decisions, is depth. A lot of people are talking about depth and legacy and how we accumulate technical depth and all this kind of stuff. Obviously, there's a subtle kind of technical depth, which is the one you don't know about yet. But I don't want to talk about this. Let's talk about the one that you're going to accumulate on purpose. So you have deadlines, you have something to do, and you're saying, right, we're going to accumulate tech depth to be able to deliver this thing faster. And that's fine. That is a totally, that's a tool, that's an instrument that is available to the business to move forward. They can use depth. Everyone uses depth. It's leverage. You can basically buy a house with a mortgage. That will be depth. You're leveraging your small pot of money that you have to get this house. And what you're getting with that is essentially an asset, right? You're going to be paying. And if you rent this house, if you're paying the debt for like $1,000 a month and you're getting $2,000 from the rent, well, then that's good debt. You should definitely do that. That's a good idea. If you're getting into debt to buy designer clothes or a new car, like you just I really want a Tesla, I'm just going to go and buy a Tesla. I get into debt with a Tesla, and well, maybe that's not the kind of debt you want to get into. So this is the obvious thing. Now there's this thing that people see like in more of a subtle way, because the thing is, non-tech founders or people who don't understand technology, usually most of the time, what they see is new features are lucrative, they bring money, and anything else is a liability. So yeah, if you just ask me if I want to accumulate technical debt to get this new feature faster, yes, all the time. There's no decisions. It's always yes. The thing that they're missing here is how much interest rate they're paying for this debt. And no one tells them, and no one is able to actually understand it. It's like you're going to the mortgage broker, you're going to buy a house, and they give you the money, and you don't know how much interest rate you're paying. If you're getting like a house, probably fine. Now, where it gets a little bit more complicated is when people are betting on things. So if I see a painting or a piece of art and I see it and I'm like, oh, I think this is going to worth 10 times the value next year. And I'm start getting a loan to buy this painting. If I don't know the interest rate, maybe the interest rate is actually higher than the expected return on the expected value of this painting that I actually just bought. And that's where people, I think, from the business point of view, are actually missing when they're making those decisions, is that they always say yes, 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 because new features are valuable and they can sell them and they're visible to the customers. But how much do you pay for that internally within your team? And the cost of it is very, very diverse. You'll be tempted to think that the cost is only that it is going to take slower to deliver these features. But for instance, another cost that is sometimes overlooked is that your developers or your team is going to burn out, or they're going to leave. They're just going to say, "Oh, this is too bad," or "This code is just terrible," or this environment isn't good enough," and they're just going to quit and go somewhere else. Another thing as well is that you might end up with people who are minions. They just do whatever you tell them, and you'll never innovate. You never bring anything new in this company. All these like little subtle decisions that you're taking have tremendous impact on everything else underlying the actual code base.
So last point that I want to talk about when discussing decision making, and that's probably my favorite way of making decisions, because it's easy, it's simple, it's straightforward, and you're actually very likely to make a good decision when you decide to go that way. And this decision making technique is called copying, or taking inspiration from other people around you. Now, it doesn't really mean plagiarism, because if everyone is doing it, it might have entered common sense, and it might actually be something that is just normal. It might be something that you've never done, but everyone in the market is doing. And so it's really around deciding and understanding what is the way of doing something. And we've seen this a lot with the kind of copy-paste type of developer. And it's true that it's very much looked down upon. But at the same time, if you think about the feature and if you think about the end result, is it getting the same kind of result? And I have to be honest, even as an experienced developer, sometimes there are things that I completely forgot and I don't even know how to write them anymore. So being honest about it, I sometimes have to Google things, go on Stack Overflow, and then copy paste what I see around. Especially when we go towards the realm of regex, for instance.
Oh yeah. I can tell you about this. There's like this the SQL query about grouping stuff with having. Like every time I have to do it, I have to Google it, and I see it that it's just like the link is purple, and I visited it already. Like it's probably the 10th time I just click on it, and I'm like, yeah, I need to remember this. I need to write it down somewhere. I need to remember. But yeah, you can't really remember everything. And to get on the copy-paste developer type, because there's this O'Reilly parodies book, which is copy-pasting from Stack Overflow. I think it's fine to copy-paste stuff from the internet. The reason why the people who copy-paste from the internet are looked down upon is because they don't understand it. So, if you see something on Stack Overflow and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, and you copy paste it and you just run the thing and it works, that's fine. You essentially found a way of doing something and you understand it. The reason where it's when it's wrong, or where it's just like, in my opinion, when it's wrong, is when people go on Stack Overflow, go on the internet, they Google something, someone says something, they copy paste it, and they go like, yeah, all right, let's try, we'll see. And then they run it, and then it works, and they don't know why it works or why it doesn't work. It doesn't work, they just go on the second answer, copy paste what the person has said, and just try again. And if it works, they just go like, cool, it works, next. And I think that's where that's the problem here. The problem is not about copying from other people. The problem is copying without understanding. Another thing is copying the application or the decisions that have been made. As you said, if everyone's doing it, all websites look the same. There's a header at the top, and there's the logging button at the top right. It's kind of like expected. These became patterns. So one thing that works well for making decisions is you literally carbon copy something to begin with, and then as you go, you start developing your own style, but at least you start with some strong foundations that you know already work.
Really nice chatting with you, and I really enjoyed this conversation of us together.
Likewise, it was. Thank you for having me.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.